The morning of September 19th, 1944, near the French village of Arracourt, Lorraine, Lieutenant Edwin Leeper sat in the commander's seat of his M18 Hellcat tank destroyer, straining to see through fog so thick it reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. Behind him, 3 more Hellcats from C Company, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, waited in a slight depression near Arracourt-La Petite. The fog was moving, dense, gray. It wrapped around the Hellcats like cotton, and Leeper could hear his own breathing inside the cramped turret. Then, through the murk, 30 feet away, a gun muzzle materialized. Long, massive, the distinctive shape of a German 75mm KWK-42 Panther tank. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the fog. An entire company of Panthers from the 113th Panzer Brigade, advancing blindly through the morning haze toward the American positions. They had no idea the Hellcats were there. Leeper gave the order. His gunner fired. The 76mm gun of the Hellcat cracked through the silence. The first Panther lurched, smoke pouring from its hull. Within 5 minutes, 5 German tanks were burning. The Panthers had cost the Third Reich approximately 117,000 Reichsmarks each to produce. Factory new machines, many still bearing the smell of fresh paint and unburned oil. Their crews were inexperienced, rushed through training and sent west to stop General George S. Patton's Third Army. Now they were dying in the fog, killed by vehicles the Germans had been told were inferior to their superior engineering. One of the Hellcats was hit. The crew bailed out. Leeper's platoon held position. 10 more German tanks appeared through the fog. 10 more were destroyed. Another Hellcat was knocked out. Sergeant Henry R. Hartmann's M18 alone destroyed 6 Panthers. The German tanks that survived turned and fled at high speed, disappearing back into the fog, leaving behind 16 burning hulks and the bodies of crews who had believed their machines were invincible. This was not supposed to happen. German doctrine, German training, German confidence all rested on a simple assumption. The Panther was superior to anything the Americans could field. Its frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees. Its gun could penetrate a Sherman tank from 2,000 meters. American tanks, according to German intelligence assessments, were junk. Adequate perhaps for colonial policing, unsuitable for modern armored warfare against a professional military. The German tank crews advancing through Lorraine in September 1944 had been told this repeatedly. They believed it. They were about to learn otherwise, and the lesson would cost the 5th Panzer Army over 200 armored vehicles in 11 days of fighting. If you made it this far, you're officially a good viewer. The next mission? Hit the subscribe button so your effort doesn't go to waste. The story of Arracourt begins not with tanks but with maps and miscalculations. By early September 1944, the German Wehrmacht was in full retreat across France. The Normandy breakout, Operation Cobra, had shattered German defensive lines in late July. American armored divisions raced eastward, bypassing German strongpoints, cutting supply lines, leaving entire divisions stranded without fuel or ammunition. The French population, which had endured 4 years of occupation, watched German convoys fleeing toward the Rhine with a mixture of relief and vengeance. By September 5th, elements of Patton's Third Army had advanced over 400 miles in less than a month. They crossed the Meuse River, liberated Verdun, and pushed toward the Moselle River line. The speed was unprecedented. German commanders, accustomed to methodical Soviet offensives on the Eastern Front, found themselves unable to react to the pace of American mobile warfare. Adolf Hitler watched this disaster unfold from his headquarters at Rassenburg in East Prussia. He ordered a counteroffensive. The objective was simple: halt Patton, throw him back across the Moselle, recapture Nancy and Lunéville, stabilize the front before winter. For this mission, Hitler assembled the 5th Panzer Army under General Otto von Manschufel. Manschufel was 57 years old, Prussian aristocrat, a veteran of the Great War where he had served as a hussar officer. He had commanded panzer divisions on the Eastern Front with skill and ruthlessness. He understood armored warfare. He understood how to use terrain and surprise. He had taken command of 5th Panzer Army on September 1, 1944, just 18 days before the battle at Arracourt. His force was built around newly formed panzer brigades, the 111th, 112th, and 113th. These brigades were an experiment. Each consisted of a battalion of 45 Panzer IV medium tanks and a battalion of 45 Panther tanks. The Panthers were Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34. They mounted a high-velocity 75mm gun, far superior to anything on a standard Sherman tank. Their armor, especially frontal armor, was virtually impervious to the 75mm gun of most American tanks. The crews, however, were another matter. The Panzer brigades had been formed in haste. Many crew members had less than 4 weeks of training. They had never worked together as units. The tank commanders were often promoted NCOs who had survived the Eastern Front but lacked experience leading company or battalion-sized formations. The brigade commanders themselves were junior officers elevated beyond their competence by casualties and desperation. German tank production in 1944 was running at approximately 300 Panthers per month. But experienced crew training required 6 months. The mathematics were brutal. Germany could build tanks faster than it could train crews to operate them effectively. Manschufel knew this. His orders from Hitler's headquarters were explicit. Attack west from the Vosges Mountains. Cross the Langres Plateau. Drive to the Moselle. Eliminate the American bridgeheads east of the river. Recapture Nancy. Do this quickly before American reinforcements arrived. Manschufel studied the maps. The terrain in Lorraine was rolling farmland, open fields interspersed with small forests. Good tank country if you controlled the high ground. The Americans, he noted, had established a bridgehead at Dululourde, north of Nancy. Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, approximately 3,000 men with Sherman tanks, was consolidating near the village of Arracourt. They were exposed. Their supply lines stretched back across the Moselle. If the 5th Panzer Army could strike quickly before the Americans dug in, they could destroy the spearhead and restore the German defensive line. The plan was reasonable. The execution would be catastrophic. On September 13th, Combat Command across the Moselle at Dululourde after the 80th Infantry Division had secured the bridgehead 2 days earlier. The crossing was unopposed. By September 18th, CCA was firmly established around Arracourt, about 16 kilometers east of the river. They were commanded by Colonel Bruce Clark, a hard-driving officer who had led armored units since North Africa. Clark understood combined arms warfare. He positioned his Shermans on advantageous terrain. He coordinated with the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which had been attached to his command. He established observation posts on every piece of high ground. Most importantly, he kept his units dispersed but mutually supporting, never clustering tanks where a single German breakthrough could destroy multiple platoons at once. The 4th Armored Division was not a new formation. They had fought across France since Normandy. They knew their equipment. They knew its limitations and its strengths. The Sherman tank that equipped most American armored divisions in 1944 was admittedly outmatched by German armor in direct comparison. The standard M4 Sherman with a 75mm gun could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any reasonable combat range. Its own armor, 81mm at the thickest point, was vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons and tank guns. The Sherman burned easily when penetrated because early models stored ammunition in sponsons alongside the crew compartment. American tankers with dark humor called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter advertised as lighting on the first strike. But the Sherman had advantages that German intelligence consistently underestimated. It was mechanically reliable. A Sherman could travel 500 miles between major breakdowns. A Panther often broke down after 50 miles. Especially the new models coming from factories where slave labor had sabotaged fuel lines and oil systems. The Sherman's turret rotation was powered by a hydraulic system that allowed it to traverse quickly. A Sherman gunner could swing the turret a full 360 degrees in less than 15 seconds. A Panther's manual turret took nearly a minute. In a close-range engagement, that difference was lethal. The Sherman's gun stabilization system, primitive by later standards, allowed it to fire with reasonable accuracy while moving. German tanks had to stop to shoot accurately. In fluid, chaotic combat across open ground, this mattered. Most critically, the Sherman was available in overwhelming numbers. By September 1944, there were approximately 40,000 Sherman tanks in service with Allied forces. Replacement Shermans were arriving in France at a rate of over 1,000 per month. Crews could be replaced. Tanks could be replaced. The industrial capacity of the United States was so vast that losing 50 Shermans in a single engagement was tactically painful but strategically irrelevant. Germany, by contrast, had fielded approximately 6,635 Tiger, King Tiger, and Panther tanks since the beginning of the war. Each loss was irreplaceable. Each crew lost represented months of training that could not be replicated. The Americans could trade tanks at unfavorable ratios and still win through attrition. The Germans could not. The M18 Hellcat that would define the battle at Arracourt was a different beast entirely. Designed as a tank destroyer rather than a tank, it mounted the same 76mm gun as the late-model Sherman but on a chassis that weighed only 17 tons. The armor was minimal, less than 1 inch thick on the turret. The crew compartment was open-topped. In a direct engagement with a Panther, the Hellcat would lose. But the Hellcat was not designed for direct engagement. It was designed for speed and ambush. Its top speed was 55 miles per hour, faster than any tank in the world in 1944. It could reach combat positions before the enemy arrived. It could fire from concealment using terrain for protection instead of armor. Then it could withdraw at high speed before return fire arrived. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had been equipped with Hellcats since summer 1944. They had tested the prototypes, provided feedback to the designers, integrated the new vehicles into their tactical doctrine. C Company, which Leeper commanded, consisted of 3 platoons, each with 4 Hellcats. 12 vehicles in total. They operated independently, often screening ahead of the main tank formations, hunting for enemy armor, calling in artillery and airstrikes. Their orders at Arracourt were straightforward. Protect CCA's flanks. Provide mobile anti-tank firepower. Engage enemy armor at ranges where their gun had penetration capability. Survive. On the German side, the 113th Panzer Brigade was preparing to attack. Its commander, Colonel Hans Traut, had received orders on September 18th. Advance toward Arracourt. Destroy American armor. Link up with the 111th Panzer Brigade attacking from the south. The orders were vague on details because German reconnaissance had failed to locate American positions accurately. 5th Panzer Army Headquarters had no integral scouting units. The Panzer Brigades themselves lacked experienced reconnaissance elements. German commanders were advancing with maps but without detailed intelligence. They did not know where American tanks were positioned. They did not know the strength of American defenses. They did not know that Combat Command A had been reinforced with tank destroyers specifically designed to kill Panthers. Traut's Panthers moved out in the pre-dawn darkness of September 19th. The fog was unexpected. Lorraine in September often had morning fog that lifted by mid-morning, but this fog was dense, reducing visibility to under 100 yards. The Panther crews, already inexperienced, now had to navigate blind. They followed roads because cross-country movement in fog was impossible without getting lost. The roads led them directly toward American positions. At approximately 800 hours, the lead elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade reached Rechicourt-La Petite. Leeper's Hellcats were waiting. The German assumptions about American armor were not random prejudice. They were based on observed performance in earlier engagements. In Normandy, during June and July 1944, German Panthers and Tigers had dominated American Shermans in direct engagements. The battles around Cannes, particularly Operation Goodwood in July, had seen British and Canadian Shermans destroyed in large numbers by dug-in German armor. American tank crews reported similar experiences. A Sherman platoon encountering a single Panther in open terrain often lost 3 or 4 tanks before destroying or driving off the German vehicle. These combat reports filtered back to German intelligence. They confirmed what German tank designers already believed. German engineering was superior. The Panther, with its combination of firepower, armor, and mobility, was the finest tank in the world. American tanks were mass-produced junk, adequate only because of numerical superiority. This assessment was not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. It failed to account for American tactical flexibility. It failed to account for combined arms coordination that integrated tanks with artillery, tank destroyers, infantry, and air support into a single coordinated system. Most fatally, it failed to account for American adaptation. By September 1944, American tank crews had learned not to fight Panthers head-on. They maneuvered. They used terrain. They waited for flank shots where Panther armor was only 40 millimeters thick. They called in artillery and air strikes to suppress German positions before closing. They accepted that individual German tanks were superior but fought in ways that negated that superiority. This was something German doctrine, built around the inherent quality of German equipment and training, struggled to conceptualize. Manschufel himself was a realist. He understood his forces were green. He understood American air superiority meant any German movement in clear weather would be pounded by fighter bombers. He understood his Panthers were mechanically unreliable and his crews were undertrained. He urged his subordinates to attack at night or in fog when American air power was grounded. He stressed the importance of reconnaissance to avoid blundering into prepared American defenses. He advocated for coordinated attacks, multiple brigades advancing simultaneously to overwhelm American positions before they could respond. His orders were sound. The execution would fail at every level. The fundamental problem was time. The Panzer brigades needed weeks to train together, to learn combined operations, to build unit cohesion. They had days. They needed experienced officers at battalion and company level. They had promoted NCOs with no command training. They needed detailed intelligence on American positions. They had maps and guesswork. They needed mechanics and spare parts to keep the Panthers running. They had neither. The offensive that was supposed to destroy Patton's spearhead was being launched by forces that were not ready, did not know their enemy's dispositions, and could not sustain operations for more than a few days before mechanical failures reduced their combat power by half. On September 19th, all of these factors converged near a village most of the German tank crews had never heard of. The fog that was supposed to protect them from American air power instead negated their primary advantage. The Panther's long-range gun was useless at 50 yards. The superior German optics meant nothing when you could not see beyond your own gun barrel. The heavy frontal armor designed to deflect shells from 2,000 meters provided no advantage when American tank destroyers appeared at point-blank range from positions they had occupied for hours, waiting. When the first Panthers burned, the crews who survived could not understand what had happened. They had been advancing in column, following the road, moving toward where they thought American positions might be. Then fire from multiple directions. Explosions. Panthers slewing to a stop, smoke pouring from engine compartments and crew hatches. Return fire was blind. German gunners fired at muzzle flashes, hitting nothing. Within minutes, the advance had disintegrated. Tanks that had cost months to build and weeks to transport to the front were abandoned or burning. The survivors pulled back, trying to reform, trying to understand where the Americans actually were. Leaper's platoon stayed in position. 1 Hellcat lost. 15 German tanks destroyed. The mathematics were brutal. The Americans had lost approximately 34 tons of armored vehicles. The Germans had lost approximately 675 tons. The kill ratio, measured in resources rather than numbers, was almost 20-1. This was not the narrative German commanders had been taught. This was not how armored warfare was supposed to work when you had superior equipment. Something had gone very wrong, and the battle was just beginning. The Germans did not stop after September 19th. They could not. Hitler's orders were explicit. Destroy the American bridgehead. The 5th Panzer Army threw more forces into the battle. Over the next 3 days, German attacks intensified. The 111th Panzer Brigade joined the assault. More Panthers. More inexperienced crews. More commanders who had been told their equipment was superior and who kept attacking because they believed victory was still possible if they just pressed harder. On September 20th, the pattern repeated. German armor advanced toward Arracourt. American tank destroyers and Shermans waited in prepared positions. The fog lifted around midday, and when it did, American artillery observers could finally see the German formations. What followed was not just a tank battle. It was a demonstration of combined arms warfare that German doctrine had failed to integrate effectively. American artillery batteries, positioned miles behind the front lines, received target coordinates from forward observers. The shells began falling. 105mm and 155mm high explosive rounds impacting among German tank columns still forming up for attack. Then came the aircraft. The 19th Tactical Air Command, supporting Patton's Third Army, had been grounded by fog all morning. Now the weather cleared. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, 8-gun fighter bombers carrying 500-pound bombs and high-velocity aircraft rockets, appeared overhead. The German columns, exposed in open farmland, became targets. The P-47s attacked in waves, dive bombing, strafing. The rockets, fired from wing-mounted tubes, could penetrate the thin top armor of any German tank. Panthers that had survived the morning fog now burned under American air attack. One pilot became legendary during this battle. Major Charles Carpenter, chief of the 4th Armored Division's Reconnaissance Aircraft Detachment, was not supposed to be attacking tanks. His job was artillery spotting, flying a tiny Piper L4 Grasshopper, a fabric-covered 2-seat observation plane with a cruising speed of 80 miles per hour. The L4 was unarmed, vulnerable, designed to fly low and slow, calling in artillery coordinates. Carpenter had decided this was insufficient. He had mounted 6 M1A1 bazookas on the wing struts of his aircraft, 3 on each side. The installation was unauthorized. His superiors had not approved it. Carpenter did it anyway. He called his plane Rosie the Rocketer. On September 20th, Carpenter took off in heavy fog. He could not see the ground. For hours he circled, waiting for the weather to clear, listening to radio reports of German armor attacking Combat Command A. Around noon, the fog lifted enough for him to see. Below, a company of German Panther tanks was advancing toward Arracourt. Carpenter put his L4 into a dive. German infantrymen, seeing the small plane descending, opened fire with machine pistols. The fabric-covered wings absorbed 9mm rounds. Carpenter ignored them. He fired all 6 bazookas in repeated passes, diving through ground fire, reloading after each sortie. He made 3 runs that afternoon, firing at least 16 bazooka rockets. He destroyed 2 Panther tanks and damaged several armored vehicles. The Germans, who had previously ignored L4 observation planes as harmless, now shot at everyone they saw. Carpenter's attacks were spectacular but not decisive. What decided the battle was the coordinated American defense. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion, part of Combat Command A. Abrams was 30 years old, a West Point graduate. He had taken command of the battalion in September 1943 and led it through France since Normandy. His Sherman tank, which he named Thunderbolt, was always at the front. He led from the turret, fighting alongside his crews. His men respected him because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. On September 20th, when German armor outflanked 2 of his tank companies, threatening to surround them, Abrams attacked the German force directly with his command tank. The ferocity of his assault threw the Germans into confusion. His companies regrouped. Then Abrams led a frontal counterattack that routed the enemy completely. The fighting on September 20th cost the Germans 36 tanks destroyed. American losses were 3 Shermans and 3 Hellcats. The mathematics were brutal. The Germans were losing Panthers faster than they could replace them. The Americans were replacing Shermans faster than they were losing them. On September 22nd, the Germans attacked again. This time they coordinated better, combining elements of the 111th Panzer Brigade with remnants of the 113th. The attack struck at multiple points along the American perimeter. German commanders had learned something. Do not advance in column through fog. Do not expose your armor to American artillery without infantry support. Do not concentrate forces where American air power can destroy them. But the lessons came too late. The fundamental problems remained. German crews were inexperienced. German Panthers were breaking down at alarming rates. Mechanical failures reduced German combat strength by half within days, and the Americans now held every piece of high ground around Arracourt. Captain Kenneth Lamison commanded C Company of the 37th Tank Battalion. On the morning of September 22nd, his Shermans were positioned on a ridge near Bazenges-la-Petite. He had clear fields of fire covering the approaches from the north. When German armor appeared, advancing through open farmland, Lamison's company destroyed 3 Panthers immediately. The Germans recoiled. Lamison sent a platoon to occupy another ridge, cutting off the German retreat. The Panthers were trapped between 2 American positions. Within an hour, 8 more German tanks were burning. Don't overthink it. The subscribe button is not a landmine. It won't explode. Press it, you're safe. That same day, American artillery demonstrated its devastating effectiveness. German doctrine emphasized armor and infantry. American doctrine emphasized combined arms. Every American tank battalion had direct radio communication with supporting artillery batteries. Forward observers, positioned with the tank companies, could call fire missions within minutes. The American artillery was not just accurate. It was overwhelming. Combat Command A had 3 field artillery battalions in direct support, 105 mm howitzers. Each battalion could fire over 2,000 rounds per day. When German armor concentrated for attack, American observers called in time-on-target missions. Multiple batteries firing simultaneously, the shells arriving at the same instant. The effect was catastrophic. German tank columns, caught in the open, suffered casualties before they reached effective gun range. The Germans attacked Hill 265 and Hill 318 on September 22nd. These were small elevations, barely noticeable on the landscape. But in the flat farmland of Lorraine, holding the high ground meant controlling observation and fields of fire. American forces had occupied both hills. The Germans needed to retake them to break through to Arracourt. The attacks failed. At Hill 318, the Germans lost 23 tanks in the afternoon assault. At Hill 265, they pushed American forces back temporarily but could not hold the position without reinforcements that never arrived. By evening, both hills remained in American hands. The German counteroffensive had failed. Between September 19th and September 22nd, the 5th Panzer Army had lost approximately 100 tanks and assault guns. Combat Command A had lost 14 M4 Sherman medium tanks and 7 M5 light tanks. 25 Americans killed, 88 wounded. German casualties could not be accurately determined because German records were incomplete and many wounded were evacuated before they could be counted. But the operational impact was clear. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades were no longer effective combat units. They had been crippled. Their Panthers, which were supposed to dominate the battlefield, had been destroyed by inferior American tanks, by tank destroyers firing from ambush positions, by artillery, by airstrikes. General Manschufel understood what had happened. His after-action reports, captured by American intelligence after the war, were brutally honest. The Panzer Brigades had failed because they lacked training, because they lacked adequate reconnaissance, because they had attacked piecemeal without coordination. But underlying all these tactical failures was a strategic miscalculation. The Wehrmacht had assumed American armor was inferior. That assumption was based on comparing individual tanks in direct combat. It ignored the American system. The Americans did not fight tank versus tank. They fought with combined arms. Artillery, air power, tank destroyers, infantry, all coordinated through effective communications and flexible command structures. The Germans had brought superior tanks to a combined arms fight and discovered that superior tanks were insufficient. But Hitler would not accept failure. He ordered the offensive to continue. Fresh units were committed. Elements of the 11th Panzer Division, a veteran formation that had fought on the Eastern Front, were rushed to Lorraine. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division reinforced the line. German attacks continued through September 25th. Each attack followed the same pattern. German armor advancing, American defenses holding, artillery and air power destroying German vehicles before they reached American positions. Panthers burning in French fields. On September 25th, Task Force Abrams defended the town of WWII for the second time. German forces attacked from elevated positions, trying to use the same advantages of terrain the Americans had exploited. But Abrams' battalion had superior numbers now and held defensive positions overwatching all German avenues of approach. The attack was repulsed with relative ease. By this point, the 37th Tank Battalion was the furthest forward unit in Patton's entire Third Army. They had advanced beyond their supply lines, operating on captured German fuel and ammunition. Yet they held. The final German attack came on September 29th. It was a desperate effort. The 5th Panzer Army no longer had the strength for a coordinated offensive. The attacks were small, company-sized probes testing American defenses, looking for weaknesses that did not exist. That day cost the Germans another 36 tanks, 700 killed, 300 wounded. The Americans held every position. On September 30th, the Battle of Arracourt ended. Not because of a formal ceasefire, but because the Germans had no more offensive capability. The 5th Panzer Army had entered the battle with 262 tanks and assault guns. At the end, 62 were still operational. The rest were destroyed, abandoned, or broken down awaiting repair that would never come. Combat Command A had lost 48 tanks total during September. 41 M4 medium tanks and 7 M5 light tanks. The 4th Armored Division had lost 225 men killed and 648 wounded during the entire month. German losses were estimated at over 3,000 killed and 3,000 taken prisoner. The kill ratio, measured in armored vehicles, was approximately 4-to-1 in favor of the Americans. Measured in resources, the disparity was even greater. Every Sherman lost could be replaced within days. Every crew member killed or wounded could be replaced from the vast manpower pool of the United States Army. The Germans could not replace their Panthers. They could not replace their trained crews. Each loss was permanent. The Battle of Arracourt became a case study at American military schools after the war. It was taught as an example of how inferior equipment, properly employed, could defeat superior equipment poorly used. The lessons were clear. Terrain matters. Combined arms coordination matters. Air superiority matters. Logistics matter. Training matters. Industrial capacity matters. The Germans had failed on every dimension except the quality of their individual tanks. But there was a deeper lesson that German commanders struggled to articulate. American tactical flexibility had proven superior to German doctrinal rigidity. When German Panthers encountered American Shermans in the open, the Panthers usually won. But the Americans did not fight in the open. They used terrain. They ambushed. They maneuvered. They called in artillery. They adapted their tactics to exploit German weaknesses rather than confronting German strengths directly. This was not cowardice. This was intelligence. The Americans understood that winning battles required more than brave men and good tanks. It required a system that could integrate all available resources toward a common objective. Manschufel himself, in post-war interviews, acknowledged what had happened. He said the American forces at Arracourt had demonstrated superior tactics and better use of terrain. He noted that his own forces had been green, poorly coordinated, hampered by mechanical failures and fuel shortages. He did not blame his tank crews. He blamed the circumstances that had forced untrained brigades into offensive operations they were not prepared to execute. But he also noted something else. The American tanks, which German intelligence had dismissed as junk, had proven far more effective than anyone had anticipated. Not because they were better machines, but because the crews knew how to use them. The German officers who survived Arracourt carried those lessons back to their surviving units. But by September 1944, lessons were insufficient. Germany was losing the war. The industrial capacity of the United States was producing tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and supplies at a rate Germany could not match. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet offensives. The Western Front was buckling. Arracourt was one battle in a war that was already decided. But for the men who fought there, it was the entire war. For the German tank crews who died in their Panthers, believing until the end that their machines were invincible. For the American tank crews who knew their Shermans were outgunned but fought anyway, using skill and courage to overcome material disadvantage. For the tank destroyer crews who waited in the fog, letting German armor close to point-blank range before opening fire. Lieutenant Edwin Leeper survived the war. His Hellcat, one of the few that made it through Arracourt intact, continued fighting through France and into Germany. He would later write about the morning of September 19th, about the fog, about the Panthers emerging 30 feet away, about firing and watching them burn. He remembered the German crews bailing out of their stricken tanks, running through the fog trying to escape. Some made it. Most did not. He remembered the smell. Burning fuel and rubber and something else he could never adequately describe. The smell of death. The smell of war. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams continued leading the 37th Tank Battalion through France and Germany. He would become famous 3 months later during the Battle of the Bulge, when his battalion spearheaded the relief of Bastogne, breaking through German lines to reach the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. He would end the war as a colonel, having fought in every major engagement of the European campaign. His Sherman tank, Thunderbolt, would go through 7 iterations, each one destroyed or worn out, each one replaced, the name repainted on fresh armor. After the war, he would rise to command all American forces in Vietnam and later become Army Chief of Staff. The M1 Abrams tank, introduced in 1980, was named in his honor. But he always said the 37th Tank Battalion during World War II was the finest command he ever held. Major Charles Carpenter was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease a few months after Arracourt. He was sent home, told he had perhaps 2 years to live. He survived for more than 2 decades, teaching history again, running a boys' camp in the Ozarks during summers, flying when he could. His L4 Grasshopper, Rosie the Rocketer, was eventually restored and now flies at air shows, preserved as a testament to what one man with 6 bazookas and extraordinary courage could accomplish. Carpenter's final tally was 14 German tanks destroyed, including 2 Tigers, several armored vehicles, and dozens of German soldiers killed. The Germans learned to shoot at every L4 they saw. Carpenter considered this confirmation that his tactics were working. The 4th Armored Division continued its advance after Arracourt. By October, they were preparing to assault the fortress city of Metz. But the division would never again fight a battle quite like Arracourt. The Germans learned. They stopped sending inexperienced Panzer brigades into offensive operations. They conserved their remaining armor for defensive battles where terrain and preparation could offset American advantages in numbers and air power. The war became a grinding advance toward Germany, each mile contested, each village a separate battle. For the historians who studied Arracourt afterward, certain facts stood out. The American 4th Armored Division claimed to have destroyed 281 German tanks during the Lorraine campaign. German records could not verify this number because records were incomplete, because damaged tanks were often abandoned and subsequently destroyed by artillery or airstrikes, making attribution difficult. But the operational impact was undeniable. The 5th Panzer Army's counteroffensive had failed completely. Patton's bridgehead across the Moselle remained intact. The road to Germany remained open. The German assumptions about American armor, forged in earlier battles in Normandy where Panthers had dominated Shermans in direct engagements, had proven catastrophically wrong when extended to a broader operational context. The Sherman was not junk. It was a component in a system. That system, combining American industrial production, tactical flexibility, combined arms coordination, air superiority, and well-trained crews, had proven superior to German Panzer doctrine built around the superiority of individual weapon systems. The Americans had not won because they had better tanks. They had won because they had a better way of fighting. The villages around Arracourt bear memorials today. Plaques marking where Panthers burned. Monuments to American tank crews who died holding the line. The fields where Leeper's Hellcats ambushed the 113th Panzer Brigade are farmland again, growing wheat and corn. The soil, churned by tank treads in 1944, has been plowed and planted for 8 decades. But farmers occasionally unearth debris, shell casings, fragments of armor plate, pieces of track, reminders that this quiet landscape was once a killing ground. The German colonel who thought Shermans were junk learned otherwise. If he survived Arracourt, if he made it through the war, he carried that knowledge into captivity or back to Germany. The lesson cost the German army approximately 200 tanks and thousands of men. It cost the Wehrmacht any hope of stopping Patton's advance toward the Rhine. And it demonstrated conclusively that wars are not won by superior equipment alone. They are won by superior systems, by nations that can mobilize industrial capacity, train competent soldiers, develop flexible doctrine, and sustain operations over time. The United States in 1944 possessed all of these advantages. Germany did not. Arracourt was not the largest tank battle of World War II. The Eastern Front saw engagements involving thousands of tanks. But Arracourt was emblematic. It showed how the war would end, not with a single decisive engagement, but with a grinding attrition that favored the side with deeper resources and better logistics. The Germans at Arracourt brought their best available equipment, their newest Panthers, their most powerful guns. They brought doctrinal confidence forged in earlier victories. And they were destroyed by an American army that understood war was not about individual weapons but about integrated systems. The final irony is that the Panther tank, in isolation, was superior to the Sherman. German engineers had created a formidable machine. Thick armor, powerful gun, good mobility when it worked. But the Panther could not win battles by itself. It needed trained crews, adequate fuel, proper maintenance, air cover, artillery support, infantry protection, and effective command and control. The Germans at Arracourt lacked most of these. The Americans had all of them, and that made all the difference. The Battle of Arracourt ended on September 29, 1944, but its lessons echoed through the rest of the war and beyond. Military planners studied it. Tank designers incorporated its lessons into post-war vehicles. Doctrine writers rewrote manuals based on what happened in those French fields. The soldiers who fought there, American and German, carried different memories. For the Americans, Arracourt was a victory that validated their training, their tactics, their equipment. For the Germans, it was another step in a long retreat toward defeat. For both, it was a reminder that in war, assumptions kill. The Germans assumed their tanks were invincible. They assumed American equipment was inferior. They assumed an offensive spirit could overcome material disadvantage. They were wrong on all counts, and their mistake cost them a battle they could not afford to lose. The American army that fought at Arracourt in September 1944 was not the same army that had landed in Normandy 3 months earlier. It had learned. It had adapted. It had developed combined arms tactics that integrated all its advantages into a coherent system. It had proven that it could defeat the best equipment the Germans could field. The legacy of Arracourt is complex. It was a tactical victory that had limited strategic impact. Patton's advance stalled in October due to supply shortages, not because of German resistance. The war would continue for another 7 months. Thousands more would die. But Arracourt demonstrated something important. The American way of war, built on industrial capacity and tactical flexibility, could defeat German military excellence built on superior weapons and doctrinal confidence. This was the lesson the Wehrmacht learned too late. This was the lesson that explained why Germany would lose. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed even a little bit, reward yourself, hit subscribe. It's free, no war, no injuries.